Welcome back to Biblical History and Literature. We are at Lecture 21, which means after this lecture, only two more to go. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing the remainder of St. Paul's letters. Some scholars say that they were in fact not written by St. Paul, as you have anticipated, whereas tradition maintains that they were written by St. Paul. We're going to assess the reasons why scholars in fact say that they weren't written by St. Paul. We're going to talk about content, we're going to talk about language, and we're going to talk about anatomy. But before we do all of that, let's have a quick review. Just some key terms that you should be familiar with and anticipating perhaps for your upcoming exam. We talked about atonement, you will recall, in the Gospel of Luke, and we said that it literally means at one ment. And the Christian tradition maintains that this is what Christ did when he was crucified on the cross. He at one all humanity, if you will, with God by justifying them. Christology is the study of the person and nature of Jesus Christ. You will recall that we talked about high and low Christology within the Gospel of Mark. We've been talking about Christology throughout the New Testament, whether we have said so explicitly or not. High Christology is going to privilege the deity of Christ, and low Christology is going to privilege the humanity of Christ. And you will recall that the Christian tradition maintains that Christ is both 100% God and 100% man simultaneously. Justification literally means to be made right, and this is what Christ did at the point of crucifixion for all mankind. The early Christian hymn that we mentioned in Philippians chapter 2 was one that St. Paul recorded, and it attests to the early Christians' idea of the incarnation and the purpose of Jesus Christ here on earth. We talked about the messianic secret within the Gospel of Mark, and this is the ambiguity surrounding Jesus' identity. You will recall that many people within the Gospel of Mark didn't quite seem to understand who Jesus was and what his purpose was. We talked about original sin within the book of Romans, specifically chapter 5, and it's usually the Western point of view that all men, all human beings, I should say, to be more politically correct, have the taint of original sin within them by virtue of being an extension of the first man, Adam. Because we all come from Adam, because we are all present in his loins, as some theologians say, we are all tainted biologically with that original disease, that of sin. We all have it. There's no avoiding it. We talked about, recall, the alternate view, the Eastern view that says, well, no, it's not quite like a biological taint or disease, but rather we sin through free will. I don't sin because my great 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 grandfather sinned. I sin because I choose to. And often I sin out of imitation because someone has sinned toward me, so I'm going to return the favor, as we might say. But ultimately, the Easterner is going to say we sin because death is present within the world. And because we're always trying to avoid death, or to look at it another way, to achieve immortality, we're going to do everything that we can to preserve ourselves, and that often includes sin. We talked about the high priestly prayer in John chapter 17, and you will recall that this is Christ's prayer for theosis, for unity of all mankind with him and the Father. Sanctification literally means to be made holy, and we said that this is the second process of one's working out of salvation, and this is brought to the human race by the Holy Spirit. We talked about the satisfaction theory within the Gospel of Luke when we talked about atonement. The satisfaction theory has to do with Christ's crucifixion, you will recall, and is the rationale, if you will, of why God sent Christ to be crucified. He sought, we said, to punish one man, one sinless man, so that he could relieve the sin debt of all mankind once and for all. This is usually the Western idea. You'll recall that we talked about another theory within the East, that of Christus Victor, the idea that Christ was not so much the instrument of punishment, but rather that which conquered death. That's why Christ was crucified, so he could conquer death, he could destroy death, as he did within Holy Saturday. Theosis, a Greek term, recall, means union with God. Paranesis, another Greek term, remember, is an ethical exhortation, and Paul uses these frequently throughout his letters. Apokatastasis, you're learning a lot of Greek within this particular course. Apokatastasis means the final consummation, and we talked about this within 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The incarnation is when Christ, the Logos, took on flesh and became a man. This is very different than reincarnation. I want to be very clear about that. I say very different. They are similar in that they both involve taking on flesh, but we would never say that Christ was reincarnated. He was incarnated once in the person of Jesus Christ. He was the Logos incarnated into flesh. We talked about the significance of I am, you'll recall, back in Exodus chapter 3 when God himself said, I am. We underline the profundity of such a phrase throughout the Gospel of John when Christ continuously said, I am the bread of life, I am the resurrection, I am the gate. And we said that every time that he said that, what he was essentially doing is recalling that I am from Exodus and thus associating himself with it. This is what scandalized the Jews so much, because Christ was essentially saying, I am the I am the great I am, using the divine name, the Tetragrammaton. Now, of course, if you have any questions about those particular terms, be sure to write me or to post some things on Blackboard. But with no further ado, then, we're going to finish up the letters of St. Paul, or rather the spurious letters of St. Paul, as scholars would have us say. We're going to begin with the Deuteropauline letters, that is 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians. And then we're going to finish up with the post-Pauline letters, that is the pastoral letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Now, I'm not going to treat Hebrews within this particular lecture. I only have it here because tradition usually ascribes the book of Hebrews to St. Paul. Scholars today unanimously agree that St. Paul did not write Hebrews. A lot of Protestant churches will say that St. Paul did not write Hebrews, and for that reason I'm going to treat it in our next lecture. Nevertheless, I thought it would be important to include it here just so you know that from a traditional standpoint, St. Paul did write this particular book. Now, before we get into these particular letters, I want to talk about pseudonymity, or pseudepigrapha, to use the term from your textbook, within the ancient world, and talk about its context, talk about its role, and talk about ultimately its significance. Now, you probably know that a pseudonym, to use the term pseudo means false, a pseudonym is a false name. And this is what scholars maintain was going on with the Deuteropauline letters. Essentially, false names were being ascribed to these letters. Tradition says that they were written by St. Paul. These letters do in fact say within them that they were written by St. Paul, but scholars believe, because of many reasons that we'll get into in just a little while, that other people were actually writing these letters and writing St. Paul's name, that not really being their own name. Now, why would someone do this? Why would someone commit such what we would probably revere today as an egregious act against the law? Why would someone commit forgery, essentially? This is what it looks like to us. Well, again, we're going to have to put ourselves within the ancient world. Instead of impressing our own world views upon what was going on 2,000 years ago, what I recommend is that we take a little trip back, put ourselves within antiquity, and then maybe look at the situation from the eyes of those who were possibly writing and even reading these particular documents. Now, as I said, If we were to find a particular document today and it have a name ascribed to it of a very popular person, for example, a couple of decades ago, we found these diaries that had Adolf Hitler's name on them, and many people for a long time believed that they were actually written by Hitler. What it turned out to be was actually an instance of forgery. Someone wrote these diaries and ascribed Hitler's name to them in an attempt to gain some sort of fame. There's another story, a very popular story during antiquity, about a Greek physician by the name of Galen. And the story goes that one day he was walking by a local bookstore and he saw a book in the window about medicine with his name on it. And knowing that he had not, in fact, written the book, what he did is he went back and wrote another book that said, "This is how you can tell my work from those who are committing forgery, those who are putting out works with my name on them." This is forgery. This is an intentional act of dishonesty to gain some sort of notoriety or fame, or for some other dishonest reason. This is not what the ancients who were writing the Deutero-Pauline letters were seeking to do. I want to be very, very clear about that. There are a couple of other reasons why an individual might have used a pseudonym, other than just forgery. For example, one reason could be that the writer just simply wished to remain anonymous, and so he's going to use a different name. For example, Samuel Clemens did not want to be known by Samuel Clemens, so he used the pen name, you guessed it, Mark Twain. We've seen this throughout. It's not essentially forgery, it's just a wish to maintain some anonymity. Something else that we should take into account here: within the ancient world, there were no copyright laws. In other words, there were no guarantees for literacy ownership like we have now. Like if you copy someone's work, it's considered plagiarism and you can get in big trouble for that. Or if you sign your name to someone else's work. There were no such things as copyright laws, no real consciousness of plagiarism in the first place. So that's important to consider too. As well, the literacy rate was extremely low during this period. Only about 10 to 15% of people actually knew how to read and write. So reading, for the most part, for most of the populace, probably involved having someone read to you instead. It meant most people listening to someone read. So then why? Why what we would call forgery today? Why were people doing this? Well, we've already said for one reason, someone might wish to remain anonymous. Another reason could be a less than virtuous one. It could be that someone could stand to profit from it. So, for example, I write a paper about the Constitution of the United States and I sign it Shannon Smith. Some of you might read it, most of you probably would not read it. Most of the world could probably care less. But instead, say I sign George W. Bush's name to it. Well, people might be more inclined to pick it up and actually read it. They might want to pay attention more. I could stand to profit by using someone else's name. I might be able to gain a wider audience. Another reason would be to gain money off of it, to make a monetary profit off of something like that. That's yet another reason. Probably a more virtuous reason, ultimately, though, is going to be one of modesty and gratitude. And I would move that if scholars are correct, that St. Paul was not actually writing these letters like Second Thessalonians and Colossians, and other people were, other disciples were. What was probably going on is not that they were wanting to gain a profit, some money, because certainly St. Paul was not making any money off of his letters. And not necessarily because people wouldn't necessarily listen to them, but because of modesty and gratitude. Here's what I mean by this. If you think about it, the things that you learn in college are not really your own knowledge, but rather knowledge that has been passed down to you. So when you write a particular paper, you sign it with your name, and in a sense, you're not being totally honest. It is, of course, your work. You did the writing, and hopefully, you didn't plagiarize. You did the best. You did your best to put it into your own words. But what I mean is, the stuff that you're writing isn't actually your own idea created from your own mind. More than likely, it's come from someone else, whether it be your professor, whether it be Plato, whether it be St. Paul, whether it be whoever. This is what, this is the philosophy, I should say, that the ancients would have had with regard to their own writing. Rather than being presumptuous and saying that these are my own ideas about the Christian faith, they were modest and rather maintained that I received these ideas from my apostolic father, St. Paul, for example. It's ultimately also the greatest expression of flattery or gratitude that a person can give when he signs someone else's name. What he's essentially saying is that I didn't actually write this. I mean, yes, I put it into words perhaps, and maybe I used my hand to copy down the letters, but ultimately I got this again from my spiritual father. I'm grateful to him for that, so I'm going to attribute it to him. I'm going to sign his name to the document. So, just to underscore, what may seem like forgery to us nowadays was not necessarily that during antiquity. I'm not saying that it did not go on, especially for more licentious reasons, more unvirtuous reasons. But nine times, or well, perhaps I shouldn't put a percentage on it, but very often the reason would have been out of modesty or gratitude. So, how do we even tell in the first place what is actually St. Paul's and what is not St. Paul's? Well, I have here a list of tip offs here that give us clues, give scholars clues, in other words, that St. Paul probably did not write some of these letters that we're going to be talking about. We could refer to these as little inconsistencies throughout the writings. First of all, we have what is known as verisimilitude. And what this is the appearance of something being true or real. In other words, it's the use of details to give something some sort of veracity or credibility. And scholars say that we see a lot of this. For example, there are a lot of things that St. Paul would say found within these particular letters to some sort of give us some sort of inclination that, well, perhaps St. Paul did write this because we've seen this particular phrase or this particular idea or this particular usage of language within his other letters. Verisimilitude, the appearance of something to give it some sort of credibility or truthfulness. For example, I have here off the cuff remarks. St. Paul makes a lot of off the cuff remarks, a lot of rhetorical remarks, and we see these a lot through the Deutero-Pauline letters. Scholars believe that that is an attempt of an individual to mimic the style of St. Paul. A second tip off, speaking in the first person. St. Paul frequently did this. I, Paul, am writing with my own hands. I think that he uses the word I 36 times in Romans chapter 7 alone. He speaks in the first person quite frequently. We see this throughout the Deutero-Pauline letters. Similar vocabulary is going to be used. I don't know if this is necessarily something that discredits the fact that the writer is not St. Paul, or discredits the fact that this particular document was written by someone other than St. Paul. It seems to me that similar language is an indication that the person is actually writing the document, but nevertheless, scholars see it as an act of duplicity. Warnings against forgers and false teachers. Now, this is something that scholars really capitalize upon throughout these particular letters. We're going to see the writer is constantly saying, I, Paul, am writing this with my own hands. There are forgers, there are false teachers, there are people that come and try to discredit me, there are people that come and say that I said these things and I haven't. This is really me who was saying this. Don't pay attention to the other people who say that I'm not writing this. Okay, false teachers, warnings against forgers. Probably mostly, though, the thing that scholars are going to have a problem with when it comes to the Deutero-Pauline letters versus those solid 7 letters that we discussed are differences in soteriology, that is, the process or the way one is saved, the study of salvation, and eschatology, the idea of end things. St. Paul has a very, very particular idea of how one is saved throughout the solid 7 letters. As we've said in his solid 7 letters, St. Paul speaks of salvation as a process, not an overnight thing. He says that salvation is nearer to us than we first believe, indicating that it's not something that's just simply had overnight. It's not just simply a ticket that is punched, but something that is gained through sanctification, brought by justification. And then differences in eschatology as well, and we'll talk about some of those. Let's begin first with 2 Thessalonians. Now, scholars believe that if any of the Deutero-Pauline letters were authentically Pauline, this is probably going to be the one. This is the letter most likely, scholars say, to have been written by St. Paul. They don't believe that it was written by St. Paul, but if we had to lay them all out, 2 Thessalonians is the one that is most likely written by St. Paul, scholars say. There are reasons for suspicion, though, as I said, that St. Paul did not write this particular letter. And the reason can be either pro or con. The reason is similarities. Scholars believe that because there are so many similarities within 2 Thessalonians and 1 Thessalonians, that 2 Thessalonians couldn't possibly have been written by St. Paul. I know that that sounds really, really strange. Some of you might be thinking, well, shouldn't the fact that there are similarities be the indication that St. Paul wrote both books? That there's some continuity, that there is consistency? Well, scholars are going to say that that is an attempt by the synonymous writer to actually create or to contrive some sort of credibility within the letter that he is writing. So, some similarities, for example, that we see within 2 Thessalonians that perhaps you will recognize from 1 Thessalonians. We see a paranesis. Remember the paranesis that we found within 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, we command you, brothers and sisters, to keep away from every believer who is idle and disruptive and does not live according to the teaching you received from us. Remember, St. Paul warned about individuals who were idle and who weren't working. And if they weren't working, then they didn't deserve to be able to reap the same benefits as those who were actually working. We see an exhortation for imitation. So then, brothers and sisters, stand firm and hold fast to the teaching we passed on to you, whether by word or mouth or by letter. And this is where we actually get the idea of tradition, passing down. The Greek word here would be paradosis, literally means to be handed down, to be traditioned onto you. We get talk of tradition within 1 Thessalonians as well. And then requests for prayers. Now, I mean, this seems to me to be a staple of any of St. Paul's letters. I don't know why that scholars necessarily see this as an attempt to contrive or convince someone that it was St. Paul. I mean, this is, again, a sort of mainstay. And pray that we may be delivered from wicked and evil people, for not everyone has faith. Now, as I say here, these similarities are thought to reinforce Paul's themes from 1 Thessalonians and are therefore regarded as proof that 2 Thessalonians was written by Paul. So, in other words, for we traditionalists who believe that St. Paul actually wrote 2 Thessalonians, the similarities are not something that suggests that 2 Thessalonians was not written by St. Paul, that it was an attempt to contrive or an attempt to trick someone, but rather is proof that it was St. Paul, because what is being said within 2 Thessalonians has already been said within First Thessalonians. It's a reinforcement of what St. Paul has already taught. Continuing on with 2 Thessalonians, we see a suspicion of forgers, though, as we anticipated just 2 slides ago. The writer says, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by teaching allegedly from us. That is, people who are coming into the community saying, St. Paul said this and that about the coming of Christ, whether by prophecy, by word of mouth, or by letter, asserting that the day of the Lord has already come. This is a major difference within eschatology we have here. Remember, eschatology means the end things, the coming of Christ. Within St. Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, he believed that the return of the Lord was imminent, that the parousia was at any moment, and that everyone should be alert. Within this particular passage, though, it seems that some people were going around saying that, in fact, that day has already come. St. Paul is saying, or the writer is saying here, don't listen to those individuals that say that we have been saying this. It hasn't come yet. And then he goes on to talk a little more about eschatology. He says, don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. Now, interestingly enough, I have to admit it, we don't see any of this type of language. We don't see any of this type of eschatological thinking within 1 Thessalonians. What we see within 2 Thessalonians here regarding eschatology is totally new. I don't think that that's something to ultimately object over, because certainly St. Paul's theology can evolve over time. His mind can change. He can have new revelations, the traditionalist might say, but nevertheless, the scholar is going to find it entirely too suspect. This man of lawlessness that St. Paul is speaking of, though, is typically referred to within the Christian tradition and also within 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, as we'll see, as the Antichrist, that is, the individual who opposes Christ. Now, this is not the same as Satan or the devil, so don't get those two mixed up. In fact, we're going to talk about the Antichrist some more within Revelation, but this is the antagonist. This is the individual who is going to arise to pit a lot of the populace against the person of Jesus Christ. Some scholars have speculated that the writer's stress that the end is not imminent is actually a reaction to apocalyptic fervor. And we've already talked about apocalyptic fervor within 1 Thessalonians. Remember, many people were afraid that the Lord had already come and had skipped over them, essentially. Some were afraid that those who had died before the Lord came would somehow not inherit the kingdom of heaven. There was a great deal of apocalyptic fervor. Many people, even St. Paul, believed that the end was imminent. Some scholars, again, have speculated that this particular book is a reaction to all of this, trying to quell fears, trying to subdue people and say, No, the end is not here yet. The man of lawlessness has not come. Now, I'm not going to read through all of this for you. Rather, I'll just let you pause the lecture and read it yourself. I encourage you to. This was written by a man by the name of St. John Damascene. He was prominent within the 8th century AD, and this is his response to what the Antichrist is and when it will come, or rather that it shall come. He does not exactly put a date on it, but he does elucidate exactly what the Antichrist is. I'll let you read that for yourselves. Here's a picture of St. John Damascene, an icon of him. Moving on to Colossians. Remember I said that two major types of theology that are going to be under close scrutiny when examining the Deutero-Pauline letters against the solid 7 letters are going to be, firstly, soteriology, and then secondly, eschatology. Now, we've already talked about eschatology. Let's talk about soteriology for a moment. Remember, soteriology is the study of salvation. Is it in the future? Is it something that we gain after a long period of struggle? Is it in fact a process? Or is it something that happens in the past for an individual and is experienced within the present? Now, I've already said within the solid 7 letters of St. Paul, salvation is talked about as a process, and that has been unanimously within the Christian tradition. Not within all strands. I understand within some Protestant strands thinking is somewhat different, but from a traditional Christian standpoint, salvation has always been something that is worked out over a period of time. One is not saved officially until the end of his life. This was St. Paul's position very clearly throughout his own solid 7 letters. We tend to get a sort of different take on this, however, within the book of Colossians. So just to give you an example, let's compare 2 verses. So in Romans chapter 6, one of St. Paul's solid 7 letters, he says, "For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will, future, certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his," this ultimately culminating in salvation. And I quoted just a moment ago a verse from St. Paul when he said that salvation is closer to us now than when we first believed. Again, we talked about St. Paul running the goal and not yet having achieved it, but he presses on toward that goal within Philippians. And then we also talked about in Philippians again, chapter 2, verse 12, work out your salvation in fear and trembling. For the writer of Colossians, however, salvation is talked about a little bit differently. The writer says, "Having been buried with Christ in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through your faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead." So you see within Romans chapter 6, St. Paul says we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection, anticipating this, whereas the writer in Colossians speaks of these things being raised, the resurrection, in the passive voice, in the past tense, in which you were raised with him through your faith. Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Now, I don't think that these two things are ultimately contradictory or mutually exclusive or something silly like that. In fact, salvation may be thought of as both. It can be thought of, in a sense, as something that is within the present, at least from God's point of view, because remember, everything for God is within the present moment. It is within the now. There is no future within the sight of God. But at the same time, for us, there is in fact a future. There is in fact a time to come. And we see this, I think, in a very good example of Christ's own talk about the kingdom of heaven, about what salvation ultimately culminates in. He says that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, futuristically in Matthew chapter 3. But at the same time, in Luke, he says that the kingdom of God is within. So it's both futuristic and it is present. Salvation is present. It is here. It is here for the taking, but yet it is to be worked out. It is to be struggled for at the same time. Within Colossians, we get very, very high Christology. We saw an instance of high Christology within the Gospel of John, the first chapter. We're going to see it again within Colossians chapter 2. This is yet another attestation to the incarnation. Colossians chapter 2, he is the image of the invisible God. Christ says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created. Think about what St. John said, that through this Logos all things were made. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things are held together. He's the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent, asserting Christ's preeminence over all creation. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And this is very, very important for Christology. What this asserts is that Christ is not just 50% God or 75% God or somehow lesser God than God, but the fullness of God the Father, the text is saying, dwelled within Christ, was pleased to dwell within him. Through him all things were reconciled, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Here is an early icon of the incarnation. We see here the Blessed Virgin with Christ within her womb. The Logos, we always know, remember that it is God. By the nimbus around his head, we see the 3 Greek letters that spell out Ho'om, which means literally I am, the being one, the incarnation of this God within her womb, whom she gives birth to as a person of Jesus Christ. Another feature that we find within the book of Colossians is an idea of hierarchy within the ancient community. Now, our own democratic worldview, this idea of equality and egalite, is a very modern one. This would not have been the worldview of, in fact, the ancients. And scholars have questioned whether St. Paul actually wrote this particular letter. For this reason exactly, scholars maintain that within the solid 7 letters, we don't really get this idea of hierarchy as much as we do within the book of Colossians. I find that a little objectionable. I do see a great deal of hierarchy, of aristocracy, we might even say, within Paul's solid 7 letters. He does talk about submission quite frequently. He even talks about master and slave within the book of Philemon, as we saw. And he didn't necessarily object to the fact that there was such a relationship. Nevertheless, I thought that it would be interesting at least to call a little bit of attention to it within the book of Colossians, just to give us an idea of what antiquity would have been like, juxtapose it perhaps to our own democratic worldview, and maybe even for discussion's sake, if you'd like, compare the two and discuss what model would have been most effective for society. What I have here is known as the 5 constant relationships within Confucianism. Now, I understand that this is a course in Christianity, Judaism and Christianity. Nevertheless, there are so many similarities here that I could not help but to include it. Some of you probably know that I also teach a class in comparative religion, and from time to time I enjoy comparing the 2 religions to one another to see the similarities. So within Confucianism, there is a strong sense of hierarchy within society, and it begins at the very basic, and it sort of moves up like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We begin with the elder friend and the younger friend. The younger friend is to be deferential, that is, reverential, we could say, to the elder friend, while the elder friend is supposed to be considerate. And likewise, a younger sibling respectful to the elder gentle to the younger, the child respectful to his parent, the parent nurturing to child, wife obedient to her husband, husband caring for his wife, the subject loyal to his ruler, and the ruler benevolent to his subject. And Confucianists say this is a proper working order. And if everyone is obedient, that is, if there is reciprocity within these particular relationships, then society will work as a well oiled machine. Everything will be in its proper order. There will be maintenance. Now, we see this very similarly, interestingly, too, within the book of Colossians. The writer here, again, tradition maintains St. Paul. I happen to believe that it's St. Paul, too, speaks of this sort of working order, this hierarchy. He says, wives, submit to your husbands, that is, be obedient to them, as is fit to the Lord. Husbands, care for your wives, love your wives, don't be bitter against them. Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. Servants, obey your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service. That means doing it just because people are watching you do it, because you're only a men pleaser at that point. Rather, do it in singleness of heart, without expecting anything in return, only for the sake of God, for the fear of God. Masters, give unto your servant that which is just and equal, knowing that you yourself have a master who is in heaven. Now, again, I can't help but to look at the similarities here, because for the Confucian society, you may be asking the question, well, who ultimately does the ruler capitulate to? Well, within Confucianism, there's this idea of the mandate of heaven. That is the great ruler who is in heaven that everyone has to ultimately submit to. So the takeaway from this is just simply to know that there would have been a sense of institutionalization within antiquity, certainly a sense of hierarchy and aristocracy, this idea of democracy, that everyone deserves equal rights and is equal, would have been quite foreign to the mind of the ancients. We're going to get a warning against false mysticism within the book of Colossians. Now, St. Paul doesn't necessarily see mysticism as a bad thing. Certainly, we've already pointed out moments of mysticism. St. Paul has mystical experiences that he records in his own letters. But there were some, evidently, who were coming into the community contriving mysticism, that is, trying to induce mystical experiences by asceticism, fasting too much, or other forms of magic or something like that. St. Paul warns very sternly against false mysticism within Colossians and tells people to beware of it. There's no profit in it ultimately. Now, I want to talk about the book of Ephesians for just a little while. This is a book that most people, or most scholars I should say, believe to have been least likely to have been written by St. Paul. If 2 Thessalonians is the one that is most likely written by him, Ephesians, scholars say, is the one that is least likely written by him. Three chief reasons for scholarly skepticism. Firstly, vocabulary. There are a lot of words, a lot of phrases used within this particular letter that we just don't see within Paul's solid 7 letters. The style. Remember, St. Paul has a very specific style. We talked about the anatomy of letters. Is different than what we have previously seen. And then also some of the things that St. Paul talks about, the content, in other words, is different than what we have previously seen. Just a few things about the letter to the Ephesians, though. Firstly, this article at the very beginning of the book of Ephesians, that this is a letter to Ephesians, was later added. In fact, this would have been, this particular letter was meant to circulate as a sort of generic or canned letter, not for just the church in Ephesus, but rather for all churches. Now, we have not seen this yet. 1 Corinthians, for example, was occasional in style and was written particularly for the Corinthian community. The book of Ephesians, however, is meant for all communities, and it talks about things very generically. Now, first, the first chapter within verse 15 says, "Ever since I heard about your faith," so we have someone speaking here within the first person, seems to indicate that the writer had no first-hand knowledge of his audience. Remember, St. Paul is actually going to call people by name. He visits these churches. In fact, he has established these churches. Evidently, the person writing to the church in Ephesus did not establish this particular church. In fact, it's suspect that he actually knew them by name, by person. A second point, something else that's very interesting that we could talk about within the book of Ephesians, is this idea of deification and freedom from sin. Deification, or theosis, is understood to be unity with God. And as the Christian maintains, this was the entire point of the incarnation, that Christ served as the bridge, the mediator between man and God, so that man might cross over and become one with God. And I have here two very popular quotations that early saints said concerning the incarnation. For example, St. Irenaeus of Lyon said, "God became all that we are, so that we might become all that he is." That is, Christ, or God, the Logos, became a man so that we men may become one with God. God became man in order that man might become God, St. Athanasius says. I want to be very clear just for a moment, though, about what deification is and what deification isn't. Deification is not this idea that man becomes exactly what God is, that he's somehow absorbed into God and he is no longer himself. Got to be very, very clear about that. I have here a few quotations. Man does not become God as such, I say. Deification, Bishop Callistos Ware in his book The Orthodox Way says, is an I-thou relationship. The thou still remains thou, however close the I may draw near to it. The saints are plunged into the abyss of divine love, yet not swallowed up, not absorbed, I should say. Christification does not signify annihilation. You might liken this to a marriage. The idea within the marriage is that the two become one. And this is within the Christian tradition, this is said to be a mystery. This is a very mystical experience. Jim is still Jim and Susan is still Susan, properly speaking, yet they are joined as one in this union. And this is what deification is essentially, when man becomes united with God in a sort of mystical marriage. Of course, infinitely more powerful, infinitely more beatific than any marriage that could take place on earth. It's the perfect union. Man, in no way either, becomes an equivalent to God, as if now there are two gods, or three gods, or four gods. This passes for theology within some particular religions, but this is not what the Christian is saying. I want to be very, very clear about that. There is only one first principle. There is only one first cause. That is God. Peter is Peter. Paul is Paul. Philip is Philip, St. Macarius says. Each one retains his own nature and personal identity, but they are filled with the Spirit. What deification is then? Well, then what exactly are we saying? I have here several quotations from the Bible of what we're talking about, and I'm ending with two from Ephesians, since I am talking about deification within the book of Ephesians. Things that we've already seen within Matthew, for example. Deification is becoming perfect like God. Second Corinthians, St. Paul talks about it. For you know the grace of our Lord Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, that through his poverty you might become rich. God became man, that man might become God. That they may be one as we are one, Christ prays in his high priestly prayer. The Son is the image of the invisible God. We just saw this within Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. And to know this love that surpasses knowledge, St. Paul, or the writer of Ephesians, says, that you may be filled with the measure of the fullness of God, the pleroma tutheou within Greek, to be filled with God, as Bishop Callistos, where plunged into the divine abyss of God, yet not being consumed by it, swallowed up in it. And we see that this is exactly what happened with Christ. We draw the parallel there. The fullness of God dwelled within Christ, and now the writer of Ephesians is praying that the same fullness of God that dwelled within Christ dwell within mankind. Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and the knowledge of God, become mature, attaining to the measure of the fullness of Christ. So not only the fullness of God, but the fullness of Christ, the pleromatos tou Christou, what we essentially see here as a oneness, being filled with the fullness of God, being filled with the fullness of Christ, Christ being filled with the fullness of God as well. Ultimately, what John chapter 17 says right here, that they may be one as we are ultimately one. We have here icon of the transfiguration, this idea of oneness. We talked about the transfiguration very briefly within the Gospels, and this is when the apostles are going to see Christ before their very eyes, seem to transfigure and begin to exude with exceeding whiteness and brightness his deity, his godliness. And on either side, both Moses and Elijah appear, demonstrating themselves to be the law and the prophets. I've always found this story very, very intriguing. What the tradition maintains is it's not the case that Christ just simply transfigured before these men at a point in time and then he went back to his old self, like he sort of, I don't know, flipped on some sort of eternal light switch and began to glow, but rather that he was always shining forth like this. It was just simply a point in time when the scales from the apostles' eyes fell, so they were able to see just for a moment, just a brief glimpse, Christ's true identity. Now, for the pastoral epistles, very briefly, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, it has been suggested that these letters were written around the same time and in fact by the same person, again because of the similarities. We see between 1 Timothy chapter 1, 2 Timothy chapter 2, the writer identifies himself as Paul, and he exhorts the Father and Christ, calling him Lord, writing to Timothy. Timothy was a disciple of Paul. He was also a pastor in Ephesus. Titus, remember Titus, we talked about him within the book of Acts, was also a disciple of Paul, and Titus would have been a pastor at Crete. Major problems are still plaguing these communities, and we see these problems outlined within these respective letters. The first being false teachers, people coming into the community, saying things that are unorthodox. And secondly, problems of disorganization. Now, we've already talked about organization and the hierarchy, how people should function. This is going to become an increasingly more sensitive subject as Christianity begins to progress and to burgeon and to become more institutionalized. We can't just simply have disorder, essentially. We have to have a hierarchy, we have to have maintenance, we have to have structure. So increasingly problems of disorganization are going to be pointed out for the benefit of the community, so Christianity can become a more organized religion. The writer is going to deal, for example, with this disorganization by labeling people as heretics. And you might sample Romans chapter 1, verses 24 through 32. A heretic, you will recall, simply in its basic definition, heresy means to make a choice, but a heretic is an individual who chooses against what is right, what is orthodox. You might compare what we have here within 1 Timothy again to what is found within first chapter of Romans, chapter 24 through 32. The writer is going to warn against myths and in what he calls endless genealogies as well. This is definitely some stuff that we don't get within St. Paul's solid 7 letters, to be very certain about that. Nevertheless, it's still very important because ultimately he says these myths and genealogies cause us to forget about the important things of Christianity, that is faith, that is piety, that is sanctity, that is ultimately salvation. So certain persons, by swerving from such things, have wandered away into vain discussion, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. And for that reason, we can't just allow anyone to be a teacher. We have to make sure that the teachers are individuals who are just, who understand the virtues, who understand the laws, not just people that speak well, essentially. As well, Gnosticism. Remember that old heresy from 1 Corinthians? It seems to still be afoot within this community, and we do know for a fact that Gnosticism was still a popular heresy during this particular time. And the writer of 1 Timothy warns against it. He says, turn away from godless chatter and opposing ideas of what is falsely called knowledge. And remember, Gnosticism comes from that Greek word gnosis, means knowledge. We get another paranesis within 2 Timothy. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient. This is kind of an anti-paranesis. In other words, the writer is pointing out everything that a person should not be, and is saying, in fact, be the reverse of these things, be the opposite of these things. Have self-control, be gentle, be lovers of good, don't be treacherous, don't be hasty, instead be patient, don't be conceited, instead be humble. This writer is extremely concerned with institutionalization, hierarchy, and leadership. Look at the first chapter, verses 1 through 13. I don't have enough space for it here, but if you're interested in this particular subject and institutionalization within the early church, this is probably the best passage for you to consult. As well, for the writer, only men should be the leaders within the church as a whole, not just this particular church, but within Christianity as a whole. And this is certainly a point of contention within contemporary Christianity. Should a woman be allowed to be a preacher or not? Within Protestantism, it is allowable within, I think, just about every sect at this point, that a woman be a preacher. Sometimes she might even call herself a minister or a priest. Within traditional Christianity and Orthodoxy and Catholicism, women are not allowed to be priests because, for many reasons, but we see here at the very, very beginning of Christianity, they were not allowed to be priests. A woman should instead, the writer said, learn to be quiet and full of submission. He says he does not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and who became a sinner. It could be argued, many modern scholars do argue, that this particular writer was not very sympathetic toward women at all. In fact, that they tried to intimidate women into submission. I don't think that that is necessarily the case. I think what tradition would ultimately say is that men have their role and women have their own role. And it's not that one is necessarily better than the other. It's just, again, one of difference ultimately. Again, not a democratic worldview. But though women are falsely deceived, easily deceived, I should say, ultimately they do have hope in salvation. In other words, not all is lost. And the writer has a very peculiar brand of soteriology here. He says ultimately a woman is going to be saved through childbearing if she continues in faith, love, holiness, and propriety. Now, this does not mean that any woman who has a baby is saved. That's not what the writer is essentially saying here. But what is going to save her, the working out of salvation, is going to be her rearing a child with faith, love, and holiness, with propriety. Another reason why scholars would call this particular letter into question is because, again, with the treatment of women, how it differs from 1 Corinthians. And you might even compare what this letter, 1 Timothy, has said about women with what St. Paul has said about women within 1 Corinthians. And I'll let you judge for yourself and read through this. He says, ultimately, St. Paul says that woman was created for man, that man was not created for a woman. He tells women not to cut their hair. He says that it is disgraceful for women to shave their heads, that a woman should cover her head, in fact, in church. He says that maintain the traditions that I have given you. Understand that the head of the household is the husband. He is the head of his wife. Christ is the head of the household itself. And we see here again hierarchy. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since she has had it shaven. And then he just goes on to talk about long hair, short hair, and what's best for a woman to have ultimately. But essentially what we see here is that for St. Paul, at least within the church in Corinth, it is permissible for a woman to pray, presumably aloud, and to even prophesy. Now this, of course, is different than being an actual priest, a lay person doing this within the congregation, versus someone who is actually serving, conducting the liturgy that would have been going on in church. But nevertheless, there is somewhat of a difference. I think that's not undeniable. Now, at this point, I've used this term a couple of times. This idea of institutionalization has certainly taken hold of Christianity. That is, Christianity has become a lot more structured. We now have things like archbishops and bishops and priests and laity, and certainly designations between these. There are going to be codes of conduct that are going to be given. A Christian should do this and a Christian shouldn't do that. Doctrine and method is going to emerge. There are going to be ideas surrounding baptism, how baptism should be conducted, as well as the Eucharist as well. And a hierarchy is going to be established. At the center of this hierarchy, if we were to look at this as a series of concentric circles, we have Christ. Christ is always the center. But from that, again, we move in terms of authority away. Archbishops, bishops, priests, or clergy, what we could also include as deacons as well. And then finally the laity, that is the lay folk who are just simply members of the church. Now I want to leave you here with several questions, perhaps that you would like to entertain on Blackboard. Consider them closely. Again, as always, if you have any questions for me, write me directly. We've got 2 more lectures. Make sure that you're keeping up with your readings. Make sure that you're fulfilling all of your assignments. And I look forward to talking with you next time.